In the previous lesson, we started to look at the various consequences of the Second World War. We saw the fate of the Axis powers. In this lesson, we look at a significant consequence of the Second World War, which was the outbreak and the onset of the Cold War. Therefore, we understand that yet again, after one major conflict came to an end, another popped up. But this was a very different conflict. So let us look at what the Cold War was all about. After looking at two world wars, one after the other, one thing definitely comes to our mind. Who was the Cold War fought between? Was it yet again Germany versus the rest of the world? It wasn't, because we already have seen that Germany was left powerless and was split up into multiple portions, out of which emerged two nations under the influence of the post-war superpowers. Who were these post-war superpowers? You see, after the end of the Second World War, two nations emerged as the superpowers of the world, and these were USA and the USSR, or the Soviet Union. They emerged as the post-Second World War superpowers. The Second World War came to an end particularly because of the collaborative effort done by these superpowers. Over here you see two very powerful images which symbolize the end of the Second World War. On the right we see Soviet soldiers are raising the Soviet flag from the Reichstag, or the Parliament building of Germany, after the Allied invasion of Berlin. And on the left we see US soldiers raising the US flag from the Mount of Iwo Jima, which is in Japan, after the invasion of Japan by the Allied nations. So not only do these two pictures showcase the fall of two major Axis nations and thus the end of the Second World War, it's more important that these defeats are at the hands of the two new superpowers. The defeat of Germany at the hands of the Soviet Union, and the defeat of Japan at the hands of United States of America. And they were the ones who emerged, as we already have mentioned, as the two new superpowers. And the conflict that emerged between them became the Cold War. Now, what was the Cold War all about? Was it like a third world war? Let's look at that now. Now, the Cold War was primarily an ideological conflict between USA and USSR. But was this like a third world war? Let's look at that now. What is a Cold War? You see, a Cold War is quite unlike any other form of conventional warfare. For starters, there is little to none direct fighting involved. A Cold War, on the other hand, involves a state of political hostility, or an immense amount of political unfriendliness supplemented with intense military tension, either between two major countries or two power blocks. And power blocks often are an alliance of multiple nations, each led by a major nation. Now, this is what a Cold War is. The political hostility in a Cold War can involve the use of propaganda, subversion tactics, threats, and even application of economic sanctions. And the military tension can extend to military alliances, increase of armaments among nations, and also intense rivalry when it comes to military situations. But all these measures go right till the end, but stop short of open warfare. So the tensions increase to the last level, but it stops before direct war breaks out. So the notion of war always exists in a Cold War, but the war never truly breaks out. Now, this is the definition of a Cold War, but the term Cold War itself was specifically coined to explain the conflict that emerged between USA and the Soviet Union after the end of the Second World War, as such a situation did not exist in any previous phases of history. So now that we understand what a Cold War is, now Cold Wars are specifically ideological conflicts, and they are played more with the mind than on the battlefield. So a Cold War often resembles a game of chess. Now, the Cold War was fought between the two superpowers, but how did the situation exist where two superpowers were extending a conflict of such a nature? All the previous conflicts and war that we have seen involve major nations on both sides, who often used to form alliances to fight against each other. So how did the world become bipolar? Now, bipolarity refers to a situation where international relations are dominated by two superpowers. How did such a situation come into being after the end of the Second World War? The primary reason why USA and the Soviet Union emerged as the post-war superpowers is because they both led decisive victories against the Axis nations, and therefore they became politically important. The people of the world started to revere these powers as saviors of humanity. Now, we already remembered that there were more allied nations who emerged as the victors of the Second World War. Now, these allied nations were particularly Britain and France, and in the pre-Second World War period, they often were perceived as the superpowers of the world. But these nations were badly affected by the war and therefore lost their previous significance and position as superpowers. And in this vacuum that was created, USA and the Soviet Union emerged as the new superpowers. And finally, not only did USA and the Soviet Union not stop after the Second World War, they in fact led massive post-war armament and reconstruction, which made them more powerful than any other nation in the world. They were able to create their own spheres of influence based on their ideologies and centered around their geopolitical position. The spheres of influence were often like their own empires, and this made the world turn bipolar. And when the conflict of Cold War emerged between these two superpowers, the conflict also became bipolar, leading to a split of the world into two parts. But what caused the Cold War? What were the factors behind the rise of such an unusual and prolonged conflict? Let's look at that right now. The primary cause behind the Cold War between USA and the Soviet Union was a conflict of ideologies that emerged between them. Now, if we remember that the Second World War was also caused by a conflict of ideologies, which was primarily three-pronged. It was capitalism versus fascism, Nazism versus communism. Now, communism was followed by Soviet Union and China. Capitalism was followed by major Western nations, and fascism and Nazism were the extreme ideologies of the European Axis nations of Italy and Germany respectively. Now, with the outbreak of the Second World War, the two rival ideologies, communism and capitalism, had to come together and form a temporary truce to deal with the Nazi and fascist tyranny. But we remember that after the end of the Second World War, Nazism and fascism were eliminated. But just because communism and capitalism had formed a truce did not mean that their previous rivalry was completely eliminated. The moment the Second World War came to an end and these two ideologies were able to deal with their mutual threat, they again got engaged in a severe ideological conflict, and therefore capitalism versus communism emerged as the major ideological conflict in the post-war period. And this was led by USA and the Soviet Union, because communism was followed by the Soviet Union and capitalism was followed by USA. Both these superpowers felt that the other power's ideology is a plague upon the world, and therefore they did everything possible to eliminate these ideologies. And not only that, they also extended their influence over other nations who now followed their ideologies, and these nations formed a part of their spheres of influence. Now, soon came a situation where the world was split up into two parts, each part following one particular ideology. We can see that in this globe over here, where the blue section is the capitalist world and the red section is the communist world. The blue section of the capitalist world was led by USA, and the red section of the communist world was led by the Soviet Union. So this remains the primary cause behind the Cold War, an ideological conflict which existed between the USA and the Soviet Union. Let us now look at what this ideological conflict was all about in a brief manner. Before we move ahead, can you answer this question? What is the ideological conflict behind the Cold War? Was it capitalism versus Nazism? Was it communism versus Nazism? Or was it communism versus capitalism? The correct answer is communism versus capitalism. So we already understood that the primary ideological conflict between the two powers was communism and capitalism, and this is also the main reason why the Cold War broke out. But what were the differences between these two ideologies? These were mostly economic in nature. Now, while communism believed in the means of production or all the inputs of production being owned only by the government, Capitalism believed that means of production should be owned and managed by private individuals. Not only that, capitalism also allowed property to be owned by private individuals, whereas in communism, private property as a concept did not exist and no private individual can own their own property. Not only that, in communism, the government took all economic decisions through economic planning, whereas in capitalism, the government did not get involved in these economic decisions and left all of this to the market itself. So this was the primary ideological conflict between the two superpowers. They believed in differing economic models. But this became the base for a prolonged conflict between the two nations that went on for 30 years. Another cause behind the Cold War was an armament race that existed in the post-war world. Now, just because the Cold War was an ideological conflict and the end of the Second World War should have been enough for the nations to realize that they should lay off armaments, quite the opposite happened. In fact, nations aggressively started to arm themselves. And not only that, these armaments also went to a nuclear proportion, because after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world knew that now they need to have nuclear weapons in their arsenal to be truly powerful. That is why this armament race went nuclear, and just because Soviet Union knew that USA had its own nuclear weapons, they also started to develop their own nuclear warheads. Now this armament race was particularly fueled by the mutual suspicion between nations and also a diplomatic rivalry that existed in the post-war period, and this created immense amounts of global tensions. Now another cause which triggered the Cold War was the use of aggressive propaganda by the two powers. Now such aggressive spread of propaganda by the two powers was particularly done to prove 2 points. The first being that they are the best power and they have the most righteous ideology. And the other is that the significant rival has the worst ideology, it's a plague upon the world, and therefore they need to be eliminated. Such aggressive spread of propaganda not only divided the world into two parts, it also made the conflict more intense. This propaganda was spread by all possible mechanisms. It was through publication, posters, television, films, and also through radio. Now we can see two instances of such Cold War propaganda over here. On the left, we see a United States anti-communist propaganda, which shows a grim future of USA if it ever goes under the grasp of communism. The poster reads, "Is this tomorrow?" And therefore it portrays a question to the American public and then shows some glimpses which can be best described as something straight out of hell. Now, the purpose of this poster is to increase fear against communism in the public's heart and to also raise anti-communist sentiments so that the American public supports the existence of the Cold War. Now, on the right, we see a Soviet anti-capitalist poster which reads, "Comrade Lenin is cleaning the earth of its filth." We can see a caricature of Lenin, the person who is responsible for the rise of communism in Russia. And we can see Lenin is holding a big broom and cleaning the earth of its garbage or filth. And what has been described as such garbage? Now we can see that Lenin is cleaning the world of its old monarchs, which are the kings and the emperors, the clergymen, and of course the capitalists. So we can understand that the purpose of this poster is to give a clear message to the Soviet public that the greater aim of communism is to rid the world of these social evils, the primary of which is capitalism. Now that we have seen the causes behind the Cold War, let's address a very important question. How was the Cold War fought? Since it's such a different kind of conflict, how was the Cold War fought? Were there any use of weapons? Did it involve any form of fighting? Or was it a war of the mind alone? Let's see that while understanding how was the Cold War fought. The primary way in which the Cold War was fought was through armed intimidation. Now, just because the Cold War was an ideological conflict did not mean that the two sides had simply gone and thrown away all their armaments. Quite on the contrary happened, in fact, because the Cold War period goes down in history as the most intense weapons stockpiling ever recorded. Now, both the superpowers and their allies started an intense arms race between themselves. Now, this caused an increase of weapons stockpiling. Now, have you ever seen ants in the summer season. If you observe them carefully, you will see that they are carrying and storing food in their anthills all throughout summer because they know that they will require this in the winter season. The same is the case of weapon stockpiling. Weapon stockpiling is not done when a direct war is ongoing. It is done when a direct war is expected. And imagine a condition when such a direct war is expected for 30 long years, where every single day it is felt that a war will break out, and not any war. This war would be nuclear, as after the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world very well understood that any further conflict would involve nuclear armaments. So there emerged a constant arms race, and this arms race also included the race for having the most number of nuclear weapons as well as the ones that are most powerful, because in this period weapons were developed that were 80 times more powerful and devastating than the ones used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now you might ask the question, who in their right mind will use up all these nuclear weapons which could easily wipe the world multiple times over? Now you see, the use of nuclear weapons was always considered to be a last resort. The red button was to be pressed only when no other option presented itself. The true nature of possessing such deadly armaments was armed intimidation. It was meant to intimidate each other or to create a situation where one nation steers away from direct warfare because they know that the other power possesses such a deadly weapon. So intimidating each other was the primary reason why these nations had such deadly armaments. We can see that in this illustration over here, where the two sides are fighting each other with arrows while they have in their arsenals such deadly bombs, but those bombs comes with a message, and that is on no account to be used because the enemy might retaliate. So such an aggressive armament was primarily for intimidation. But even though there was no direct war, the world felt the pressure of such intense armament. We can see that in this picture over here, where the world is practically squeezed between the bombs of US and the bombs of Soviet Union, and it created a situation where the entire world was obsessed to have the most number of nuclear weapons. Now we just mentioned that the entire world was obsessed with having the most number of nuclear weapons. But why the entire world? We already know that the Cold War was primarily a conflict between the two superpowers. And how does the entire world come into play? This is because these two powers increased their spheres of influence and gave all nations two options, either with us or against us. Now these nations, if they chose the side of USA, automatically became the rival of the Soviet Union, and if they chose the Soviet side, then they became targets of USA. It was as if these nations had no other choice. So therefore the two superpowers expanded their sphere of influence to other nations. Now, a sphere of influence refers to a situation in international relations when one major nation has the capability to affect economic and military decisions in another nation or a region, even though it has no political right to that. Now, by extending their spheres of influence to these nations were treated as extensions of the superpower in terms of political strength, military power, and economic might. Now, does that not sound like imperialism in modern clothes? Now, of course, the superpowers did not pursue the creation of colonies, and again, they did not exploit these nations as much as the colonial powers did. But yet again, these nations almost had no sovereignty left, as the decision of the superpower automatically was to be reflected in their actions. Now we can see this extension of the spheres of influence in this map over here, where the portion shaded in blue are all the nations that were aligned with USA, and the portion shaded in red are all the nations that were aligned with the Soviet Union. And this created a division of the world into two parts, and that was the primary mechanism by which the Cold War was fought. But how does a conflict which goes on for 30 years really last without any direct fighting involved? That is because this conflict was primarily fought employing espionage, secret diplomacy, and the spread of propaganda. Now, these powers conducted aggressive espionage against each other, where they employed spies in these superpowers as well as in the nations that falls in the respective sphere of influence of their rival superpower. Now, whenever we say espionage and the employment of spies, the idea of James Bond comes to our mind. But did you know that James Bond itself is a creation of the Cold War period? And that is because the spies were often the soldiers of the Cold War. Since no direct fighting was involved, the spies were used to carry on the actual ideological conflict. These spies were used to retrieve military secrets, to destroy the weapon placements of other nations, and to also carry out political assassinations. Now, while the spies were the soldiers of the Cold War, the diplomats were the commanders, and they managed to secure strategic alliances and therefore increase the spheres of influence of the superpowers. Now, these spheres of influence became the hotbed of secret military action and espionage, which disrupted the progress and the prosperity of these nations. But it was in these nations where the Cold War was primarily fought using espionage, secret diplomacy, and also by spreading propaganda against each other to showcase that one nation is more powerful and more superior than the other one. But it was not that no amount of fighting took place in the Cold War. Now, while no direct fighting took place in the two sides, there were, however, some instances of conflict which were indirect, and that was through proxy wars. Now, what is a proxy war? Imagine a situation where you and I hate each other and desperately want to fight each other. However, we know that if we do so, we will end up killing each other, which would mean that there would emerge no winner. So we go out to the playground and we see two kids are fighting amongst each other. Now each of us choose one kid. We mentor the kid, we train them and also provide them with weapons, and then we let them fight each other. Whichever kid wins, its mentor also wins at the same time. That is the idea of a proxy war, and that is how military confrontation was done in the Cold War period while avoiding direct conflict. So often proxy wars were fought in the Cold War period where the powers backed the two sides of a regional conflict in some part of the world. At one time, thousands of such regional conflicts are ongoing in different parts of the world. It could be between two nations, two factions in the same nations, or even between two political leaders in one nation. These superpowers went and chose one side each, and therefore they fought against each other while avoiding any form of direct confrontation. Now, while this ruined the prosperity of these regions, the Cold War was adequately fought out, and such proxy wars include the Vietnam War and the Korean War. But why did the Cold War never turn into a full-fledged war? Now, do you remember the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Well, if you don't, the world clearly did after the end of the Second World War. They knew that any full-fledged war would see the employment of nuclear weapons, and there would not be a world to save at the end of such a direct warfare. And that is why, even despite constant military tension, all the ideological conflict that existed between the superpowers, the constant insistence to be number one, and even the multiple close encounters where a war could easily have broken out, it still did not, because the world knew that any full-fledged war would lead to the annihilation of humanity altogether. And that is a key reason why the Cold War remained cold. Now, what were the results of the Cold War? What were some consequences left by the Cold War? Let's look at that now. Now, another result of the Cold War was the creation of multiple military alliances. Now, you see, to increase their spheres of influence, both superpowers pursued alliance with the other countries through many military groupings. These military groupings included NATO or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, SEATO or the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, the Warsaw Pact, CENTO or the Central Treaty Organization, among many others. And what these military groupings had in similar was a particular clause, the clause of collective security, which stated that if one nation of a military alliance gets attacked by a rival nation, then all the nations in the military grouping would rush to defend their ally. So a conflict which previously would have included only two nations would now include multiple because of such military groupings. And that is why these military groupings further divided the world and increased tensions globally. Now, one such instance of Cold War military alliances dividing the world into two parts is the conflict between NATO versus the Warsaw Pact, which divided Europe into two parts. Now, NATO was created by USA and therefore it was the military alliance of the capitalist nations, whereas the Warsaw Pact was an initiative of the Soviet Union and therefore it was the alliance of communist nations. And these two alliances managed to divide Europe into the Western Bloc or the capitalist bloc and the Eastern Bloc or the communist bloc. And that is how Europe was divided by these two military alliances, and so was the case of various other regions of the world, which also done through these military alliances. Another major result of the Cold War was the formation of a three-world order. Now, in this map, we can see this three-world order, where the portion shaded in green refers to the First World or the capitalist world led by USA. The portion shaded in red refers to the communist world led by the Soviet Union, and the remaining portion shaded in yellow refers to a third world, which was formed solely by the Cold War. The third world was comprised of newly independent nations of Africa, Asia and Latin America, and they wanted to stay away from the spheres of influence of the two superpowers and decided to stay neutral. And out of this insistence to stay neutral came up the formation of the non-aligned movement, the logo of which we can see here. We will see more about the formation and also what the non-alignment movement is all about in subsequent chapters. Finally, as a result of the Cold War, a very different kind of race popped up, and that was the technological race. Now, since there was no direct confrontation due to a lack of that between two superpowers, the competition which existed between them also extended to all other possible fields, particularly in the fields of technological and scientific achievements. And one such example of a competition between USA and the Soviet Union in the field of technological and scientific achievements is the space race. Since space is always considered to be the final frontier, both these superpowers made it a point to be the leaders in space innovation. Now, while Soviet Union managed to put Yuri Gagarin in space and therefore made him the first man in space, USA won the space race by putting Neil Armstrong on the moon, making him the first man on the moon. The Cold War finally came to an end in the 1990s, but this was after 3 decades of prolonged ideological conflict between the two superpowers. The Cold War primarily came to an end after both the powers reduced tensions amongst themselves, alongside a global movement which popped up which demanded a freezing of the arms race or the reduction or demilitarization of the intense stockpiling of weapons that took place in this period. There also were some political events that took place in this time which further solidified or further cemented the end of the Cold War. These include the fall of the Berlin Wall, which we remember was erected to divide Berlin into two parts, and this was done to signify the creation of a united German Republic, and finally also the collapse of the Soviet Union which took place in this time, which once and for all ended the Cold War. This period also saw the activities of the non-aligned movement which helped the world reduce tensions in the Cold War period, and the Cold War also came to an end thanks to the non-aligned movement which was a response of the third world nations to deal with the Cold War crisis, and this helped the world reduce tensions in the Cold War period and also bring the Cold War to an end. Now, in this lesson, we saw a very significant consequence of the Second World War, which was the Cold War itself. In the next lesson, we will look at some other major consequences of the Second World War. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers, or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million plus questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it is rewarding too. So register for free now.